We're counting down the 30 winter bunkhouse suppers ranch hands ate when blizzards buried the range. These were the meals that kept men alive in Montana line shacks and Texas cow camps when the wind piled snow to the eaves and the nearest town sat 3 frozen days away. From beans that simmered 12 hours on a cast iron stove to pies built from nothing but vinegar and memory, each dish tells a story of isolation, hunger, and hard-won ingenuity that modern kitchens can barely imagine. Expect cuts of beef your butcher no longer sells, desserts made from suet and dried fruit, and the strange genius of men who fed 20 hands with 1 Dutch oven and a snow shovel. Which forgotten supper tops our list? Let's begin the countdown with number 30. Number 30. Salt pork and milk gravy held the bunkhouse table together when a storm closed the wagon road for a week. Cooks bought sowbelly by the slab, packed in barrels of coarse salt, because it kept through a winter without ice and cost a fraction of fresh meat. The slab was sliced thin as a playing card, soaked in water or canned milk to draw out the brine, then fried in a skillet until the edges curled and the fat ran clear. Flour went into the drippings, then evaporated milk, stirred until the gravy turned pale and thick enough to coat a spoon. Poured over split biscuits, it was salt, fat, and heat in a single plate. Hands called it poor doings and ate every bite anyway. Number 29. Stewed tomatoes and bread turned a single tin can into supper when the root cellar ran thin. Canned tomatoes arrived on ranches by the case, one of the few foods that survived a jolting freight wagon without spoiling. And by the 1880s, no chuck box in the West traveled without them. The cook emptied a can into a pot, added a spoon of sugar, a knob of grease, salt, black pepper, then tore in stale biscuit or hardtack until the whole thing thickened into a red porridge. The acid cut through weeks of salt meat, and old-timers swore it was the only thing on the range that tasted like a garden. Men drank the leftover juice straight from the can, cold, standing in the doorway. Number 28. Fried cornmeal mush gave the bunkhouse 2 meals from 1 pot. In the evening, the cook boiled coarse ground meal with water and salt, stirring until it pulled away from the sides, then poured the hot mass into a greased bread pan and set it in the cold entryway to firm overnight. By morning, it sliced clean as cheese. Those slabs hit a skillet slick with bacon fat and fried until a hard golden crust formed, served with sorghum or a puddle of gravy. Cornmeal cost pennies a pound and shipped in 100-pound sacks that lasted a snowed-in outfit for months. It filled a working man cheap, and it never spoiled. Every cow country from Texas to the Dakotas had a version. Number 27. Corn pone and hoe cakes came west with the Southern hands who filled the trail crews after the Civil War, and they never left. The batter needed almost nothing. Cornmeal, salt, hot water, a spoon of bacon grease, sometimes an egg if a hen was still laying through the cold. Cooks patted the dough into flat cakes and baked them in a Dutch oven buried in coals, or fried them straight in the skillet until the outside cracked. They came out dense, gritty, and honest, meant to be split hot and smeared with drippings. When flour ran short at a line camp, cornmeal was the fallback that stood between a man and an empty plate. Nobody praised pone, everybody ate it. Number 26. Vinegar pie proved that a bunkhouse cook could conjure dessert from an empty pantry. With no fruit left by February and eggs scarce, he stirred cider vinegar, sugar, flour, and water over the stove until it thickened, added a scrape of nutmeg, and poured the lot into a lard crust. The vinegar mimicked the sharp bite of lemon nobody had seen since fall. Baked in a Dutch oven with coals shoveled onto the lid, it came out glossy and tart, sweet enough to feel like a reward after a day of chopping ice out of water holes. Cookbooks from the Plain States carried the recipe well into the 1930s. It was desperation food dressed as a treat, and hands fought over the last wedge. Number 25. Spotted pup was the pudding that made grown men act like children. Rice simmered soft in water and canned milk, sweetened with sugar, then studded with raisins that plumped in the heat until the whole pot looked speckled. A shake of cinnamon on top, and it went to the table still steaming. Raisins traveled well, kept indefinitely, and cost little, which made them the standard sweetener of the winter camp. Trail cooks served spotted pup as a bribe, doled out to whichever crew came in wettest and coldest from riding fence in a whiteout. Oral histories from Wyoming and the Texas Panhandle recall hands eating it from tin cups with their gloves still on, snow melting in their hair. Number 24. Jerky gravy stretched a strip of dried beef into a supper for a dozen men. Winter jerky hung in bundles from the bunkhouse rafters, cured in the fall wind and hard as a boot heel. The cook pounded it between two stones, or in a flour sack, until it shredded into fibers, then dropped it into a skillet of hot grease with flour and water, and let it simmer until the meat softened and the gravy went the color of wet leather. Ladled over sourdough biscuits, it delivered the taste of real beef long after the last fresh quarter had been eaten. Line riders holed up alone in a one-room shack lived on this for weeks. It was survival with the flavor of smoke. Number 23. Canned corned beef hash showed how quickly ranch kitchens leaned on the tin can. Beef packed in South America, and the Chicago yards reached Western supply stores by the 1890s, and outfits bought it by the case as blizzard insurance. The cook opened a tin, broke the dense pink block apart with a fork, and fried it with diced potatoes and onions in a heavy skillet until a brown crust formed on the bottom. That crust was the whole point. Hands scraped for it. It was salty, uniform, and utterly unlike the beef they raised themselves. But when the herd was scattered and the wind screamed for 3 days straight, a can that needed nothing but a fire was worth more than a steer. Number 22. Root cellar potatoes and onions carried whole outfits from Christmas to spring thaw. Ranch wives and cooks buried the fall harvest in sand or straw in a dugout behind the bunkhouse, where the ground held just above freezing, and a good cellar kept several hundred-pound sound until April. On a blizzard night, the cook boiled potatoes whole in their jackets, drained them, and fried them with sliced onions in bacon fat until the edges went dark and sweet. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. The smell of onions hitting hot grease drifted through the bunkhouse and pulled men off their bunks. It was the humblest supper on the ranch, and after 4 months of salt meat, it tasted like relief. Number 21. Dried apple pie earned its own place in cowboy legend and its own complaints. Ranches bought dried apples in sacks because fresh fruit could not survive a western winter, and the shriveled slices swelled to 3 times their size once soaked overnight. The cook simmered them with sugar and cinnamon, poured the mixture into a lard crust, and baked it in a Dutch oven under a shovelful of coals. When it worked, the filling was dark, syrupy, and intensely sweet. When it did not, the fruit swelled after baking and split the crust open. Trail songs and camp poetry mocked the results for decades. Still, no dessert appeared more often on a snowbound outfit, and no plate ever came back full. Number 20. Sorghum and hot bread was the simplest sweet the bunkhouse knew, and for many hands the best. Cooks kept a can of sorghum molasses on the table year-round, thick, dark, and faintly bitter, and hands called it lick. When biscuits came out of the Dutch oven, a man split one steaming, dropped a lump of butter or drippings inside, and poured the sorghum over until it ran down his wrist. Sorghum was pressed on farms across the South and Midwest and shipped west cheap, and it never froze solid or spoiled. In storm-locked camps where sugar was rationed to the pie pan, lick was the only sweetness a working man could count on. Number 19. Calf fries turned spring branding into a bunkhouse feast, and the cook froze the surplus for the deep of winter. Sliced, peeled, rolled in seasoned flour and cornmeal, then dropped into hot grease until they puffed golden. They came out crisp outside and tender within, served with a bowl of thick cream gravy. Nothing on a working ranch went uneaten, and the men who ate them made a point of pride out of it. Bunkhouse cooks in Colorado and Wyoming kept a bucket of them packed in snow behind the woodshed, hauling out a batch when the wind kept everybody inside. Ranch country still celebrates the dish. Outsiders still wince at the name. Number 18, stuffed beef heart, was the winter roast for outfits that had killed a beef and refused to waste an ounce. The heart, dense and deep red, was trimmed split and packed with a stuffing of stale bread, onion, sage, and drippings, then tied with butcher's twine and braised for hours in a covered Dutch oven with water and a handful of dried onion. Slow heat was the whole secret. Rushed, the muscle turned to leather. Given 4 hours at the back of the stove, it sliced into rounds as tender as pot roast, each one ringed with savory stuffing. It fed a full bunkhouse from a single organ that cost the outfit nothing, and it filled the room with a smell like Sunday dinner. Number 17, roasted marrow bones were the reward the cook kept for the men who worked the worst of the storm. When a beef was butchered, the leg bones were sawed into lengths and buried in the coals of the bunkhouse stove until the marrow inside bubbled and went translucent. Hands dug it out with a sharpened stick or the point of a pocket knife and spread it hot on biscuit or cornbread, where it melted like butter and tasted twice as rich. Trail cooks called it prairie butter, and in a diet built on lean winter beef, that concentrated fat was fuel a man could feel. Cowboys riding 16 hours in below-zero wind burned calories at a rate no modern desk worker approaches. Number 16, oxtail soup made a full pot from the one piece of the animal nobody else wanted. The tail was jointed with a cleaver, browned hard in the bottom of a heavy pot, then covered with water and left to mutter at the back of the stove from noon until dark. Barley, onions, and whatever cellar vegetable survived went in halfway through. What came out was thick with natural gelatin, glossy enough to coat the lip of a tin bowl, and rich in a way lean range beef almost never was. Hands sucked the last shreds off the small bones and dropped them in a bucket for the dogs. Today, it is a restaurant delicacy. Then, it was the cheapest supper on the place. Number 15. Menudo warmed the border ranches of South Texas and New Mexico, where Vaquero traditions ran generations deep. Tripe was scrubbed, blanched, and simmered for the better part of a day with hominy, garlic, onion, and dried red chile until the broth turned deep rust and the tripe went silky. It cooked so long that a cook could start it before dawn, ride out to break ice on the tanks, and come back to a finished pot. Served with lime, chopped onion, and a stack of tortillas, it revived men who had spent a night pulling cattle out of drifts. Anglo hands often refused the first bowl and came back for the second. The dish outlived the outfits that ate it. Number 14. Frijoles and flour tortillas fed the Tejano and Mexican vaqueros who worked the southwestern ranges long before the great cattle drives, and their food shaped everybody else's. Pinto beans went into the pot with salt pork, garlic, and dried chile at first light, simmering all day in a cast iron kettle. Tortillas were rolled out fresh on a floured board and slapped onto a hot comal, blistering in seconds. A hand ate by tearing a tortilla, scooping beans, and repeating until the plate was clean, no fork required. Cheap, hot, and endlessly repeatable, it was the meal that let a crew work a frozen range on beans and lard. Half the vocabulary of the American cowboy came from those same men. Number 13, jackrabbit stew, appeared on the table whenever a storm cut the outfit off from the beef supply. Rabbits were everywhere on the winter plains, easy to shoot from the bunkhouse door, and a cook who wanted meat needed only a rifle and 10 minutes. The trouble was the flesh itself, so lean it could not sustain a working man on its own. Cooks solved that by parboiling the meat to soften it, then stewing it slow with salt pork, onions, and potatoes, letting the pork fat carry what the rabbit lacked. Dumplings often went on top. Hands called it hard times meat and ate it without ceremony, knowing that on the far side of the storm there would be beef again. Number 12. Elk and venison stew fed the mountain outfits of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, where fall hunting was as much a chore as haying. A hand shot game in October, and the meat froze solid in an open shed, staying good until March, without a scrap of ice or salt. The cook sawed off what he needed with a bucksaw, browned it hard, then let it simmer for hours with onions, dried beans, and canned tomatoes until the sinew broke down. Sagebrush-fed game carried a strong, almost sweet flavor that the tomatoes tamed. In a hard winter, that shed full of frozen elk was the difference between an outfit that ate and an outfit that started killing its own breeding stock. Number 11. Salt-cured ham with red-eye gravy came up the trail from the southern states and became a bunkhouse ritual on cold mornings and colder nights. Hams hung in the smokehouse from November butchering, coated in salt and brown sugar, and cured for weeks until they would keep a full year in an unheated shed. A thick slice hit the skillet and fried until the fat rendered and dark bits stuck to the iron. Then the cook poured in a cup of leftover coffee, scraping everything loose into a thin, sharp, salty gravy that stained the biscuits brown. It was not delicate, and it was not meant to be. It woke a man up at 4 a.m, better than anything else on the ranch. Number 10. Chili built from pressed chili bricks brought heat to the northern range long before anyone thought to sell it in a can. Dried chili pods, cumin, oregano, and suet were ground together and pressed into hard bricks that shipped anywhere and kept indefinitely. And by the 1880s, cow camps from Texas to Wyoming carried them in the chuck box. The cook browned chopped beef, shaved off a chunk of brick, added water, and let it cook down until the fat rose red on top. Beans went in where money was tight and stayed out where a man had opinions. On a night when the thermometer sat at 30 below, chili was the only supper that made men sweat. Number 9. Chicken and dumplings marked the good days in a snowbound winter. Hens stopped laying in the deep cold, and an old bird that had quit producing went straight into the pot, where hours of gentle simmering did what no amount of frying could. When the meat finally slipped from the bone, the cook stirred flour, salt, and drippings into a stiff dough and dropped it in spoonful by spoonful, clapping the lid on so the steam cooked the dumplings through. They came out swollen and soft, floating in a broth thick and yellow with fat. Ranch women were often the ones who made it, and hands remembered those suppers decades later, describing them in interviews as the closest thing to home cooking they ever got. Number 8. Sourdough flapjacks for supper broke every rule, and nobody complained. The starter keg lived beside the stove, or on the trail, inside the cook's own bedroll to keep it from freezing, and it was the most jealously guarded object on the outfit. At night, the cook stirred flour and water into the crock, and by morning it had risen sour and bubbling. A spoon of soda cut the tang, and the batter went onto a greased griddle in cakes the size of a dinner plate. Stacked 6 high, drowned in sorghum and drippings, they made a supper cheap enough to serve twice a week. Hands claimed a good sourdough starter was worth more than a good horse. Some cooks agreed. Number 7. Bear sign was the bunkhouse word for donuts, and a cook who could make them held real power over a crew. Dough went together with flour, sugar, soda, and canned milk, rolled thin, cut with the mouth of a tin can, then dropped into a kettle of deep hot lard until each one puffed and browned. Rolled in sugar and stacked on a flour sack towel, they vanished so fast that cooks learned to make 4 dozen or none. Trail lore holds that hands would ride miles across frozen country on the rumor that a neighboring outfit's cook was frying bear sign. In a life of beans and salt pork, hot fried dough was pure celebration. Number 6. Son of a gun in a sack crowned the winter table as the great steamed pudding of the cow country. The cook chopped suet fine, worked it into flour with sugar, raisins, and a splash of sorghum, then tied the whole dense mass into a scalded flour sack and lowered it into a kettle of boiling water for 2 or 3 hours while the storm howled outside. The windows ran with steam. When the sack came out and was cut away, the pudding stood dark, heavy, and fragrant, sliced thick, and served with a hot sauce of sugar, water, and vanilla. It was British plum duff, carried west by immigrant cooks and rechristened in cowboy language. Nothing else on the ranch felt so much like a holiday. Number 5. Chicken fried steak with cream gravy became the signature supper of the American ranch, and it was engineered entirely around cheap, tough beef. The cook took a round steak, laid it on a board, and beat it flat with the edge of a plate or the back of a cleaver until the muscle fibers broke apart. Then it was dragged through flour, egg, and flour again and dropped into a skillet of shimmering lard. The crust sealed hard and golden, while the meat inside went tender. Flour and canned milk stirred into the leftover drippings made the gravy poured on thick enough to hide the plate. German and Austrian settlers in Texas brought the technique. The range made it American, and it never left. Number 4. Slumgullion was the storm supper, the pot that got made when the road closed and the cook worked with whatever the shelves still held. Scraps of beef, a tin of tomatoes, potatoes, onions, a fistful of rice or macaroni, leftover beans, and water went into the largest kettle on the ranch and simmered until everything surrendered into everything else. No 2 batches were ever the same, and no cook wrote it down. Hands ate it from tin plates with hunks of biscuit, and whatever remained went back on the stove for the next day, topped up and stretched again. Oral histories from the northern plains describe slumgullion pots that ran continuously for a week during the great blizzards. It was thrift made edible. Number 3, son of a gun stew stood as the most legendary dish the American range ever produced. When an outfit killed a beef in cold weather, the parts that would not keep were cooked immediately, and the cook simmered heart, tongue, sweetbreads, liver, and the tender marrow gut together for hours, with onion, salt, and black pepper until the broth turned thick and unbelievably rich. The rule was that every ingredient came from the same animal, and a cook who added anything else was accused of ruining it. Trail hands claimed it tasted better than anything a town restaurant could serve, and the polite version of its name only appeared when a woman was present. Today, it survives at ranch reunions. Then, it was the truest measure of a cook. Number 2, Dutch oven pot roast of winter killed beef was the supper that made the bunkhouse forget the weather. Ranches butchered in the deep cold specifically because the carcass would hang and freeze in an open shed for months without spoiling, and the terrible winter of 1886 and 1887 taught every outfit on the northern plains to lay in meat before the snow came. The cook cut a shoulder roast, seared it black on all sides in a heavy Dutch oven, then buried the pot in coals with onions, carrots, and 1 inch of water, letting it cook untouched for 4 hours. When the lid came off, the meat fell apart under a fork. Steam rolled to the rafters. For one night, 20 freezing men ate like they owned the place. Number 1. Pinto beans and sourdough biscuits crowned the bunkhouse table as the meal that actually kept the American West alive. Beans went into the pot before daylight with salt pork, onion, and black pepper and stayed there all day, thickening into something dark and creamy that no quick cooking could imitate. Alongside them came biscuits pulled hot from a Dutch oven, sourdough risen overnight, split open, and swiped through the bean liquor until nothing remained on the plate. Between them, they delivered protein, fat, and calories at a cost of pennies a man, and they never quit. Hands ate this combination 5 nights a week, 6 months a year, through blizzards that killed cattle by the thousands and buried fence lines to the top wire. Old cowboys interviewed in the 20th century did not remember it fondly. They remembered it gratefully, which is different and truer. Across all 30 entries, from that first skillet of salt pork to the beans and biscuits at the very top, these bunkhouse suppers tell a story of isolation, thrift, and stubborn survival. Some, like son-of-a-gun stew and calf fries, show a world where nothing from an animal went to waste. Others, like vinegar pie and bear sign, prove that even in the hardest winter, men found a way to make something sweet. The common thread is the Dutch oven, the sourdough keg, and a cook feeding 20 hands with a snowdrift for a pantry. These were not recipes. They were the taste of a country still learning how to feed itself.